The hotel had been losing money for 11 years before Fiona Galbraith arrived, and the man who owned it had stopped pretending otherwise. His name was Thomas Kettrick, and he ran the Kettrick House the way a person tends a fire they've stopped believing will ever warm the room. Out of habit, mostly, and because stopping felt worse than continuing. The 3-story building at the edge of Millhaven sat on good land near the river, with wide plank floors and 12 rooms upstairs, and a dining hall that could seat 40. It had done that once, too. 40 people at a sitting, during the years when the timber contracts were new and the crews came through on their way north. That was before the rail spur shifted east, before the crews found cheaper lodging at Harker's Camp, before the winters started feeling longer and the hallways started feeling emptier. By the time Fiona came through the door on a Thursday morning in late October, there were 2 guests in the building. One was a surveyor who paid by the week and ate very little. The other was a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Oakes, who had been meaning to leave since August and simply hadn't gotten around to it. Thomas was behind the front desk when she walked in. He noticed her bag first. Canvas, well-worn, mended at one strap with what looked like leather cord. Then he noticed the way she set it down, not like someone tired, like someone who'd made a decision. She said she was looking for work, not a room. She could cook, she said. And she'd heard the Kettrick House had a kitchen that hadn't been used properly in some time. Thomas told her he couldn't afford a cook. She told him she wasn't asking for wages yet. She was asking for a kitchen and a place to sleep. He should have said no. He knew that even at the time. But there was something in the plainness of her offer that he didn't have the energy to argue with. And the kitchen really had been sitting dark since May, since his last cook left for her daughter's place in Kamloops and he'd gotten by on tinned goods and whatever the surveyor brought back from the dry goods store. So he showed her the kitchen. She walked through it once, slowly, touching the handle of the iron stove, checking the draft on the flue, looking into the cold larder without expression. She said she'd need flour, lard, dried beans, and whatever root vegetables could still be found. She said she'd need it by morning. Thomas drove to the supply store that afternoon and didn't entirely understand why. Fiona Galbraith was 28 years old. She had come north from the interior, from a settlement in the dry belt where she'd spent 3 years keeping house for her uncle after her parents died of influenza in the winter of 1902. Her uncle was not a difficult man, but he was a practical one, and when he remarried the previous spring, the house no longer needed 2 women managing it. He had given her $40 and his honest apologies and driven her to the stage road himself. She had been moving since May, not aimlessly. She had a list in her head of things she could do and things she was willing to do, and she had been methodical about finding the place where those 2 lists overlapped with something that resembled a future. She'd spent 6 weeks at a cannery near the coast. She'd done laundry work in a mill town for 2 months. She was not a woman who complained about hard work, but she was a woman who noticed when hard work was going nowhere, and by the time she reached Millhaven, she had $5 left and a clear sense of what she needed. She needed a kitchen. She'd always been better in a kitchen than anywhere else, and she'd learned in the months of moving that a kitchen was a kind of leverage. People would do a great deal for a meal that tasted like something. She got up before light the first morning and lit the stove herself. By the time Thomas came downstairs at 7, there was bread on the table. Not the flat, dense kind that comes from rushed hands and uncertainty, but the proper kind, with a crust that resisted and an inside that yielded, and a smell that moved through the entire building in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. The surveyor appeared in the dining hall without being called. Mr. Oakes appeared shortly after, still wearing his house slippers, and sat down without asking permission. Thomas stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking at his dining hall, which had 3 people in it, which was 3 more than usual. He didn't say anything. Fiona poured him a coffee and went back to the stove. She started with what she had, which wasn't much. Root vegetables from the cellar, some dried lard, oats, and enough flour for bread twice a day. She made a bean soup on the second day that the surveyor, a quiet man named Mr. Adler, described to someone on the street as the best thing he'd eaten since Edmonton. That someone told someone else. By the end of the first week, there were 4 people eating supper at the Kettrick House who hadn't slept there. Thomas watched this happen with the particular discomfort of a man who doesn't know whether to feel relieved or afraid. On the 8th day, a woman named Helen Sprott came in and sat down at the far end of the dining hall and ordered whatever was on offer. She was the postmistress, had been in Millhaven for 12 years, and she had the kind of face that told you she'd formed her opinion of you some time ago and was merely confirming it now. She ate the entire bowl of potato and smoked fish chowder without speaking, then asked Fiona to sit down. Helen said, "I want you to know that this building has been an embarrassment to this town for going on 5 years. Fiona said, "I know, I've been here 9 days. Helen said, "Thomas is a decent man, but he doesn't have an instinct for this kind of thing." Fiona said, "No, he doesn't." Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" It was the right question, and Fiona had been waiting for someone to ask it. She needed butter, regularly. She needed access to whatever seasonal fish and game the local families were bringing in. She could pay fair, or she could trade meals. She needed a boy who could carry and fetch and didn't mind early mornings. And she needed Thomas to understand that the dining hall needed to be open at regular hours with a board outside listing what was being served, because people would not come to a place they couldn't predict. Helen Sprott nodded slowly. She said she knew a boy. His name was Percy Lund, and he was 13. The youngest son of a trapper who worked the river system north of town. Percy was small for his age and extraordinarily competent, the way children who grow up in working households tend to be. He appeared at the back door of the Kettrick kitchen at 6 in the morning, 2 days after Helen's visit, carrying a sack of pickerel his father had pulled the night before, and said simply that he'd heard there might be work. Fiona gave him breakfast first. He ate without stopping and didn't look up from the plate. She asked him if he knew what time the supply wagon came through. He said Tuesdays and Fridays, usually by 9, sometimes earlier if the road was dry. She asked if he could be here before the wagon. He said he could be here whenever. That settled the matter. Percy became a fixture of the kitchen the way certain tools become fixtures, so integrated into the work that you stopped noticing them as separate things and only noticed when they weren't there. He hauled water and wood. He kept track of what was running low. He had a talent for appearing exactly when something needed carrying and disappearing when the kitchen got crowded. Fiona didn't praise him often, but when she did, he took it seriously, in the way of someone who understood that unearned praise was worthless. Through Percy, she learned the rhythms of the town, who had surplus eggs in autumn, which family's smokehouse produced the best fish, where to find late-season mushrooms along the north edge of the Kettrick property. The town was not large, 400 people, perhaps 5, but it had layers to it, and Percy moved through all of them without attracting much notice, which made him useful in ways that extended beyond the purely practical. Thomas, for his part, stayed mostly out of the kitchen. He was not the kind of man who liked to watch things change, even when the change was good. And there was something that had gone crooked in him over the years of difficulty that made improvement feel slightly threatening, as though it might collapse if he looked directly at it. He helped when asked and didn't interfere when not asked, which was the right instinct even if it came from the wrong place. He put the board outside that Fiona requested, painting the letters himself with a careful, unpracticed hand. He kept the dining hall fire going in the evenings without being reminded. The supper numbers grew. A week of steady service, then 2. By the 3rd week, Fiona was cooking for 15 people on a Friday night and running short on the venison stew before 8 o'clock. She told Thomas they needed a larger pot. He went and bought one the next morning without discussing it. There was a man named Gilbert Corve who owned the land the Kettrick House sat on. Thomas had told Fiona this in a brief, uncomfortable conversation during her 2nd week. The way you tell someone about a condition that's been managed for so long it's almost normal. Gilbert Corve lived in a larger town 60 miles south and had inherited the land from a business arrangement that Thomas's father had made before Thomas was old enough to understand the terms. Thomas paid rent on the building and the lot, had been paying for years, and had fallen behind during the lean months, as most people did who dealt with Corve. The man had a reputation for patience that was, on closer inspection, simply the patience of someone who preferred to collect at maximum disadvantage. The debt was not enormous, but it had grown. Fiona absorbed this information and didn't say much about it at first. She had seen this kind of arrangement before, had seen it at the cannery, had heard about it from her uncle. There was a type of man who understood that letting debt accumulate was a more efficient form of ownership than simply buying something outright. She asked Thomas how much time they had. He said Corv had sent a letter in September. The letter had mentioned December. It was the first week of November. She went back to the kitchen and thought while she worked, which was the only way she could think properly. She kept her hands moving and let the problem sit in the back of her mind and sort itself out. She did this with most problems. People who watched her cook sometimes mistook her silence for calm, which was not exactly wrong, but wasn't the whole picture either. She was not calm. She was calculating. The supper revenue was real, but not yet enough. She needed to increase the midday traffic, which meant she needed something to offer at midday that people couldn't get elsewhere, and that didn't require her to double her workload. She thought about what the town lacked. She thought about what people needed in the middle of a working day. She thought about what she could do with oats, dried fruit, lard, and a hot oven, and she thought about the mill workers who walked past the Kettrick House at noon and kept walking because there was nowhere close to stop. The next Monday morning, she made meat pies, small ones, hand-sized, with a short crust that held together even when eaten standing up. She sent Percy out to the mill at 11:30 with a basket and instructions to sell them for 5 cents each and come back when the basket was empty. He was back in 20 minutes. Helen Sprott came back the following week. Not to eat this time, but to talk. She sat across from Fiona at the kitchen work table while Fiona rolled dough, and she said what she'd been thinking about. She said, "You know what Corv is going to do when he hears the business is picking up?" Fiona said, "I've been thinking about that." Helen said, "He came through here in August, talked to Mayor Vance about the property. Vance told me afterward he'd been asking about future use, about what the lot was worth if the building came down." Fiona kept rolling. She said, "When did he say December?" Helen said, "The letter was dated the 17th of September. Thomas showed me." Fiona said, "Is there a lawyer in Millhaven?" Helen said, "There's Davies, but he's Corv's man. There's a fellow up in Fort Cedar who's decent. I met something, I think. Been practicing 12 years. Fiona made a note of that and didn't say anything else about it for several days. She kept cooking. She kept sending Percy out with the midday pies. She started serving a proper breakfast on weekday mornings, which drew in the men who worked shifts at the lumber operation east of town and needed something hot before 6. The dining hall was rarely empty now between 6 in the morning and 8 at night. Thomas had taken on a part-time girl to help with the cleaning and the table setting, a quiet young woman named Beryl, who moved efficiently and didn't require much instruction. The rooms upstairs started filling. Not all of them, never all of them, but 5 or 6 most nights, which was better than 2. Thomas did not speak about the debt directly. But one evening, after the last supper guest had gone, he came into the kitchen and stood near the door and said, without quite looking at her, "I didn't believe it could be like this again." Fiona said, "It was always like this. You just forgot what it took." He didn't answer that. After a moment, he went back upstairs. She thought it was as close to gratitude as he was likely to come, and that it was enough. Gilbert Corv arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before December. He came in a hired coach and wore a coat that was too fine for the mud on the road, and he walked into the Kettrick House at 2:30 in the afternoon when the lunch service was winding down, and there were still 6 people at the tables. He looked around the dining hall with the expression of a man revising his expectations, which was not a comfortable expression to watch. He asked to speak with Thomas. Thomas came out from behind the desk, and they spoke in the hall for several minutes, voices low. Fiona watched through the pass-through window from the kitchen. Percy, who was washing pots, watched her watching and had the good sense not to say anything. When Thomas came back to the kitchen, his face had gone the color of unbleached flour. He said, "He's not interested in the back payments. He wants to renegotiate the lease. He's offering to forgive the arrears in exchange for a new agreement, higher monthly figure, a clause that gives him the right to terminate on 60 days' notice." Fiona said, "He wants to be able to take the building back once it's worth taking." Thomas said, "Yes." She said, "Don't sign anything," he said, "Fiona." She said, "Don't sign anything today. Tell him you need to review the terms. Tell him your lawyer is in Fort Cedar." Thomas blinked. He said, "I don't have a lawyer." She said, "You will by Friday." She wrote the letter herself that evening. At the kitchen table, by lamplight, while the bread for tomorrow was doing its second rise in the warm corner near the stove. She wrote clearly and without drama, laying out the particulars of the property, the history of the payments, the nature of the proposed new terms, and the specific clause she found objectionable. She sealed it and gave it to Percy in the morning, with instructions and the money for a rider. The lawyer's name was Edmund Greer. He wrote back within 4 days, a short letter, businesslike, with several questions she had anticipated. She answered them in a second letter that same evening. Helen brought her something useful on the Thursday of that week. She had gone back through the postal records and found a letter that Corv had sent to Mayor Vance the previous August, the one she'd mentioned before. But what she'd remembered wrong was the date. The letter was not from August. It was from March, 7 months before the December deadline Thomas had been given. In the letter, Corv had described the Kettrick property as a likely redevelopment site and referenced discussions with a timber investment group based in Victoria. He had been planning this before the debt letter. The debt was the mechanism, not the reason. Fiona sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote a third letter to Edmund Greer. Corv came back on a Friday morning. He came without the fine coat this time, which was interesting. He came with a contract drawn up by his own man, the Davies that Helen had mentioned, and he set it on the front desk of the Kettrick House and asked Thomas to review it at his convenience. Thomas said, "My lawyer has already reviewed the terms of the existing lease and has some concerns he'd like to raise directly." Corv said, "Your lawyer?" Thomas said, "Yes." There was a pause. Corv looked past Thomas toward the dining hall, where breakfast was still being cleared, where Beryl was carrying plates and Percy was wiping tables and 4 mill workers were finishing their coffee in no particular hurry. The smell of the morning bread was still in the air. Corv said, "The existing lease expires in April regardless of the arrears. You understand that." Thomas said, "Edmund Greer has located the original deed of arrangement between my father and your father's estate. There are terms in that arrangement that appear to supersede the lease schedule. He's filed a query with the land registry in Victoria." Corv's expression did not change in any obvious way, but something behind it did. He said, "That arrangement is 30 years old." Thomas said, "Yes." Edmund seemed to find that interesting too. Fiona was in the kitchen when Thomas came back to tell her how it had gone. He told her in full, which was more words at once than she'd heard from him since she arrived. She listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she put a plate in front of him and sat down across the table. He said, "He left without signing anything." She said, "Good." He said, "He'd be back." She said, "He might be. It depends on what Edmund finds in Victoria." He said, "What do you think he'll find?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I think there's enough there to make it inconvenient for Corv. Whether that's enough depends on the man." Thomas looked at the plate. He said, "You shouldn't have had to do all of this." She said, "Someone had to." He said, "I mean, it's my building, my problem." She said, "It's the building where I work. It became my problem when I decided to stay. That was the plain fact of it, and she meant it as such, without sentiment." But Thomas looked up at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite respect but had elements of both, and said nothing which she understood was his way of meaning quite a lot. Edmund Greer came to Millhaven in the 3rd week of November. He was a compact man with careful speech and ink stains on his right hand that never quite washed out, and he spent 2 days reviewing the documents that Thomas had kept in a wooden box under the front desk, documents that Thomas himself hadn't opened in years. The original deed of arrangement was among them, as Fiona had thought it might be, folded into an envelope that had gone stiff with age. Edmund spread it on the kitchen table and read it slowly, twice, and then looked up and said the word easement in a way that suggested it was important. It turned out that the arrangement between Thomas's father and the Corv estate had included a residential easement, an older form of protection, uncommon but not unheard of, that had been written into deeds in certain parts of the province before the land registry system was standardized. Whether it would hold up against the current lease was a question for Victoria. But it was a question, and questions cost money and time, and Gilbert Corv had several properties, and, according to the letter he'd sent in March, an arrangement with investors who were unlikely to wait indefinitely. Corv settled the matter by letter in early December. He agreed to forgive the full arrears. He offered a 20-year lease at the original rate, with a fixed renewal option. He did not come in person to sign it. Edmund Greer witnessed the signing at the Kettrick House kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon. Percy had made himself useful by keeping the fire going and staying out of the way, which was more or less his general approach to things. Helens came by afterward and sat down and had coffee and didn't say much, which was her way of marking an occasion. Thomas picked up the signed lease and looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it back down and said, "To no one in particular. My father built this place, thinking it would outlast everything else. I'd nearly let it go. No one answered that. It didn't need answering." The Christmas supper that year was the largest the Kettrick House had seen in over a decade. Fiona hadn't planned it as a statement. She'd planned it the way she planned everything, practically, and with attention to what was available in December in a small town in the interior. There was a goose that Percy's father contributed, and 2 others from a farm family on the East Road. There were potatoes from the Kettrick cellar, carrots and turnips, and a barrel of late apples that Helen had sourced from somewhere she didn't fully explain. There was bread, as always, 3 kinds this time, including a dark rye that Fiona had been working on for weeks, getting the starter right, adjusting the timing of the rises in a cold kitchen. It was the bread that people talked about afterward. 31 people came to supper that night. They came from the mill and from the farms and from the 3 streets that made up the center of Millhaven. They came because Helen had mentioned it, and Percy had mentioned it, and because a meal worth having had become, over the past 2 months, something you could expect at the Kettrick House, and expectations, once established, pull people toward them. Thomas carved the goose himself, which he hadn't done in years. He was not graceful about it, but he was thorough, and he did it without being asked. At some point in the evening, an older man named Mr. Oakes, who had finally gotten around to leaving in November and then apparently gotten around to coming back, raised his glass and said something about the building feeling like itself again. There were sounds of agreement around the room. Fiona was in the kitchen when this happened, so she didn't hear it directly. Percy told her about it later while they were washing up. She said, "What did you say?" He said, "I didn't say anything. I was carrying plates." She said, "Good." He didn't understand why that was the right answer, but he wrote it down in the part of himself where he kept things worth remembering. And he thought about it later, after he'd gotten older and understood more about the difference between the people who needed to be in the room when something was said and the people who'd done the work that made the saying possible. There was no single moment that settled things permanently. That was not how things settled. The lease was signed, and the debt was cleared, and the dining hall was full on most evenings. But there were still weeks when the room bookings were thin, and weeks when the flour got expensive, and weeks when Fiona made a soup that didn't quite come together and had to decide whether to serve it or start over. She usually started over. Thomas had begun keeping better records. Beryl had learned to manage the front desk on the mornings when Thomas was doing maintenance. Percy had started showing up an hour earlier without being asked. The Kettrick House did not become famous. It did not transform into something grander than it was, but it became the kind of place that a town relies on without fully articulating why, a place with regular hours and a warm room and food that tasted like someone had paid attention. In a town that size, in a winter that length, that was no small thing. Fiona stayed through the spring and then through the summer. She hired a second kitchen hand in August, a methodical young woman who'd come from the Okanagan with good hands and no illusions about the work. The midday pies remained. The bread remained, in various forms, depending on the season and what was available. She added a soup board in the autumn, a daily changing list that Percy wrote out in chalk each morning on the board Thomas had painted, in his careful, unpracticed hand, that first week she arrived. She did not think of it as her kitchen, exactly. It was Thomas's kitchen, in Thomas's building, on land that belonged, now securely, to the Kettrick name. But she had made it into something that worked, which was a form of ownership that didn't require a deed. Edmund Greer passed through Millhaven the following March on his way to a case further north, and he stopped in for supper. He ate the lamb and root vegetable pie and the dark rye bread, and a bowl of the baked apple pudding that had become something of a winter fixture. And when he was done, he said to Thomas, "You have something worth keeping here." Thomas said, "I know." He looked toward the kitchen when he said it, and Edmund, who was an observant man, noticed. Spring came late that year, as it often did in the interior, and the river ran high through April, and the road south was poor for weeks. But the Kettrick House had enough put away by then, in the ledger and in the larder both, to manage it without worry. Thomas said this to Fiona one morning while she was doing the bread, and she said only that she was glad and went on with what she was doing. Outside, the town was starting its day. The mill whistle had gone at 6. The light was coming up slow and gray over the river, the way it did in that country in early spring, and Percy was on his way down the road with his collar up against the cold and the chalk in his pocket, ready to write whatever the day had to offer on the board outside the Kettrick House, so that anyone passing would know what to expect.